still joining, it's 3 o'clock. We'll start, and then, and as I'm sure you know, people will come in as we begin. But first, to say thank you, Sara. Sara Khan, for those that are joining us, was appointed by the Home Secretary to lead the Commission for Countering Extremism in January 2018. Before she was appointed, Sara was the director of Inspire, an organisation that she co-founded in 2008, a decade prior, to challenge gender inequality and Islamist extremism. And in 2016, co-authored the book, The Battle for British Islam, Reclaiming Muslim Identity from Extremism. Sara graduated from Manchester, the University of Manchester, with a master's in pharmacy. I had a biology degree, Sara, so we can talk science.
Absolutely.
And went on to complete her MA in Understanding and Securing Human Rights at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. I should also say that Sara is a source of great advice, of inspiration, and really has done tremendous things at the Commission. So thank you so much, Sara, for agreeing to do this, agreeing to join us, and for all you do.
Yeah, no, thank you, Danny. That's a very kind introduction. And I just want to say how much I admire you and all the work that you're doing at the Antisemitism Policy Trust, and how actually you are a leading voice, I think, in a lot of the work around countering extremism. So it's my absolute pleasure to be able to do this today.
Thank you, Sara. Well, let's crack on. What motivated you to work against extremism? You grew up in Bradford. Was it something from your youth, or something that developed over time?
I mean, I think definitely it's something that I kind of picked up on quite early in my youth. I mean, it's fascinating. When I remember being at school, I remember experiencing, I suppose, like many other ethnic minorities, just racism in the classroom, in the playground. But I think what also struck me was how I also saw ethnic minorities also engage in racism and bigotry against other minorities. So one of my very first experiences of anti-Semitism was from a Muslim Pakistani boy, I think he must have been about 12, dismissing the Holocaust. And it's really struck a chord with me. And also the same with other Pakistani Muslims promoting anti-Ahmadiyya bigotry and hatred. And so I kind of felt like I'd seen it from all sides, and was very aware that it doesn't just come from one source, it can come from a whole multitude of different of people. But in terms of extremism more specifically, I think what really struck me was just how organised extremists are, and their ability to reach and influence people. So maybe some of your viewers will remember back in the 1990s, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and when they organised the really large-scale conference at Wembley Arena, and I think it was something like 4,000 people turned up. Now, I had friends, Muslim friends back then, who were radicalised and recruited into Hizb ut-Tahrir, and how their whole personality changed. And so just seeing the ability of extremists to radicalise, to influence, and to just influence such a large scale of people has really struck me. But in terms of personal motivations and why I get up every morning to do this work, despite how difficult it often feels like it is, I suppose there's two major ones. The first is just I have a very strong belief in our democratic values. I strongly advocate and believe in human rights, equality, pluralism, diversity, and I see every day in my job, and as I have done for the last 15, 20 odd years, how extremism seeks to undermine and threaten those values. And I suppose that leads me on to my second motivation, which is that, and I can't say this enough, and I will, we have to say this forever really, which is that inaction in the face of extremism can never, ever be a response. It's something that struck me so much over time. And I believe then, as I believe now, that we all have a moral and ethical obligation to stand up to extremism, to publicly speak out against it whenever we see it. Because if we don't, history has shown us what the devastating consequences it can lead to. So it's really important that we all make a stand, we speak out against extremism, because it can lead to terrorism, it can lead to genocide and ethnic cleansing, but it always starts from a place of hate and extremism. So I suppose those are kind of my key reasons why I do this work.
Wow, that's actually really profound. It's interesting. I'd never thought of it in terms of democracy necessarily, but of course you're right. It undermines all of our values, and that is an impact. That really, I find that very, very interesting and important. You sat on the Home Office Tackling Extremism Radicalisation Working Group, right, in the wake of the bombings in 2005. and you advise, and then after that you advise the Department for Education. So you had a feel for, you know, what it's like to talk to government about this already. What did you learn in doing those things? Did you see things that you liked, or that perhaps you thought could be better in addressing extremism when you went through that process?
I think, I mean, the 2005, the Home Office Preventing Extremism Task Force, I mean, that was one of the very early attempts of the government to devise a counter-extremism policy and an approach. And I suppose, you know, that was 15 years ago, and things have really, really moved on from that time. I mean, in terms of the Department for Education's Counter-Extremism Expert Reference Group, which I sat on, I think it was about four or 5 years ago now, I think the thing that really struck me was the issue of extremism within schools and helping teachers deal with this reality. I mean, at that time, I was running the counter-extremism organisation Inspire, which I co-founded. And again, one of the things that really struck me at that time was the number of schools, headmistresses, headmasters, teachers who were actually contacting me. You know, we were just a small NGO at that time, and just the numerous stories they were telling me and the cries for help, where extremists were actually targeting them, abusing them, intimidating them because they were simply delivering the national curriculum, or perhaps they'd had a school uniform policy change. And those stories really were quite shocking. And I remember one incident at one school in London, which I won't name, where one head teacher contacted me and said, "Sara, I've got a real problem here. You know, I'm a head of a primary school, and I've got a father who's a former member of the BNP, and he's making his 4-year-old son watch violent videos encouraging attacks against Muslims. And I've also got a young Muslim girl, a 3-year-old girl, whose father is making her watch beheading videos." And I just thought, you know, this is what some of our teachers are grappling with. And so I think having that kind of lived grassroots experience and then looking at how government policy is developing is where of course you see flaws, you see the disconnect between what's happening at the grassroots and what's happening at government level. And so I think that was really insightful for me to see how can we actually better represent people on the ground who are experiencing victims or who are countering extremism and government policy. And that's something that I've sought to do with the work in the Commission.
Sorry, we'll come on to the next question, but there's a slight aside. Extremism, did you have to explain that in some cases, you know, it doesn't start with people going and delivering some, you know, a lecture or a video or something? It can actually start with something quite simple and lead on. It's not just, you know, immediate radicalism, extremism. You can actually have a soft start into something more extreme.
Yeah, and often I think it's something where somebody can just sow a seed sometimes, and it's something like that. I mean, there's a whole range of different factors why people get drawn into extremism. And even when we talk about particular events in our country that have happened, or is it because of those events? Well, actually, it's more about people exploiting those events. And I think that's what is a core kind of tactic of extremists. And so, yeah, it's a whole range of different factors, and it's why this area is really quite complex.
Well, you set up, and you have this long history of involvement in this area. So you set up Inspire in 2008, and it not only challenged extremism, but sought to promote gender equality. Can you talk a bit about how those two are linked?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you know, as you mentioned, I did a master's in human rights. It's at the core of who I am as a human rights activist. And so we predominantly focused on the issue of counter-extremism and, of course, gender equality. And I think the thing that struck me more and more over time was just seeing that the relationship between the two that we saw, whether it was the far right or Islamists or other forms of extremists, was this very negative perception about women and the kind of ideological worldview they have and what they view the role of women should be. And so you have this kind of tendency to deny women their rights, discriminate against them. You fundamentally do not believe in gender equality. We've seen time and time again when extremists come into power, one of the first things they often do is to curtail and restrict the rights of women. And this is particularly prominent in a number of some of the countries in the Middle East, for example. And so I think that's something that kind of really struck home with me. But also in the UK, you know, I came across many, for example, Muslim hate preachers. I mean, we predominantly focused on Islamist extremism. But again, what I saw time and time again were, Muslim hate preachers who just had this fascination and an obsession with restricting women's rights, whether it's in schools, whether it's advocating domestic violence, marital rape. And so again, I think it's really important for us as a society to recognise that relationship, and that we have to always defend and stand up for gender equality.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we, as you know, you graciously chaired a session at a conference we did on gendered anti-Semitism. And so it's something that certainly we're keenly aware of in respect of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
The punching up against each other of anti-Semitism and misogyny. You've had a chance to take this on in your current role. So January 2018, the Prime Minister announced, or I think the Home Secretary actually announced, that you're going to lead the Commission for Countering Extremism. Did you expect the appointment? Was this kind of a phone call out of the blue? Did you expect that it was happening? Had you been in talks? And what were your your goals for this role? You know, was there something you were like, this is what I want to do? Do you have something in mind?
I mean, you know, I never expected I'd get this role. I mean, it was a public appointments process. So somebody had said, look, Sara, you know, why don't you apply for it? And I just thought, you know what, I've never had that kind of public role before. And I just thought, oh, you know, I'm not going to get it. And, you know, and some people said to me, look, Sara, I'll be very upfront and honest. Most people who are public appointees are male and pale and occasionally frail as well. And again, if you look at the kind of statistics around the number of ethnic minorities who are public appointees, I think at that time it was something like 8 or 10%. So you kind of look at that and you think, I don't know, you know, is it worth me applying? And it's, you know, a lengthy, long process. But I mean, I suppose in my head, I thought, I know I can do this role. You know, I've got the grassroots experience. I've seen firsthand how extremists operate in this country. I know what it feels like to be targeted by extremes. So I understand the experience of victims, but I've delivered counter-extremism work, so I know what it's like for counter-extremism practitioners. And I thought, if anyone can do it, it can be me. And I think I'm able to do it. So I thought, what the hell, I've got nothing to lose, but I've got everything to gain. So I applied for the role, and I just, you know, finally got to the end stage, and I'm just really grateful to the then Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, to recognise and believe in me and in the vision of what I have hoped for the Commission, and for appointing me. And I suppose in terms of what do I want to achieve? Well, I think the number one issue, and it's not really changed, is really making sure we have a robust counter-extremism policy in this country. You know, I've been very critical of the government's current counter-extremism strategy. If anyone's read our report from October last year, that I don't believe it's fit for purpose. I mean, yes, the fact that they've launched the first ever counter-extremism strategy has to be applauded, but I don't believe it's doing what it should be doing. And I feel very strongly that we need a counter-extremism strategy today that's fit for purpose, that is effective, that is helping reduce the levels of extremism in this country, and that is, you know, upholding our democratic values and isn't counterproductive and is taking a human rights-based approach. That's something that I want to see, hopefully by the time I've completed my term.
Well, I've got no doubt you'll get that, and also it's important that you know, as you've just shown, you're asserting your independence as a commission, which is really, really important. And you don't need me. You certainly don't need me to explain to you. But it is remarkable that you know, that there should even be a thought about not applying for the role, and the fact that you are a living example of breaking down those barriers is, to me, is very important. I mean, we've talked about extremism. You've mentioned extremism. We haven't actually defined it for those that are on the call. What is extremism? What is hateful extremism? I know you've done this in a report, but perhaps you can kind of summarize for us. How should we be considering extremism, and what's a human rights-based approach to it?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, the E word, crikey. It was funny because when I first got appointed, one of the things that I experienced a lot was people both, I suppose, within Whitehall and also outside of it, were people coming up to me, kind of giving me a, you know, pat on the back and commiserations and saying, good luck, Sara, with that one, with coming up with a definition of extremism. You know, what kind of poisonous chalice have you decided to take up? So, you know, of course, it's quite nerve-wracking. And it's been really fascinating because I think one of the things that I did, obviously, in my first 18 months in this role, was go out and engage widely. You know, I visited over 25 different towns and cities. So I've spoken to thousands of people. We held dozens of workshops with supporters and critics and published a whole range of academic papers. And we launched the first ever public consultation on extremism, where we had 3,000 people responding. And so for us to kind of look at a whole range of different data, including hundreds of pages of government data, for me, I was trying to understand, you know, what is the consensus about extremism in this country? And what we found as a commission was there's clearly consensus around terrorism and violent extremism amongst the public. But it's the level below that. So often that what we refer to as non-violent extremism, that's when it starts becoming a bit muddy, a bit more murkier. But again, looking at all the data and the evidence, and particularly from the public consultation, what we found was what we have called hateful extremism. It's this kind of behaviours where people are inciting hatred against other people or making the moral case for violence against them based on hateful, hostile supremacist beliefs. And it's based on the idea of social identity theory, where you divide the world into in-groups and out-groups, and who are the threats to us as an in-group from this particular out-group and the harm that that's causing to our society. And so we categorise hateful extremism as something that's quite distinct and different to violent extremism, and the former can certainly create an environment that's conducive to violent extremism and terrorism. But it's a lot of the kind of the issues around hate and justifying and normalising, but through a much more, not, it's more broader than hate crime, but it's looking at it through that lens and being much more specific and defining it, and particularly the behaviours itself, which we thought was really important. So that's what we mean by hateful extremism. And I suppose a human rights-based approach to it, again, is something I feel very passionate about because of that relationship between human rights and extremism. Because again, what I've seen over the years is extremists seek to undermine human rights. And at the same time, if we as a democratic society undermine human rights and equality in this country, often that can feed extremism. So there's this kind of symbiotic relationship between the two, which we have to grapple with. But also at the same time recognising that, you know, we can go too far with counter-extremism measures where we can end up unfairly and unjustly curtailing civil liberties, where we can end up restricting free speech. So again, it's really important that if we take a human rights-based approach, we want to have a process and a policy that actively counters extremists, but is not curtailing our democratic values and norms. Otherwise, you know, we're our own worst enemy. So that's why I think developing a human rights-based approach to counter extremism is just so critical. And also, I'd finally just say that I fundamentally believe counter extremism is a human rights issue because of the fact that extremism seeks to undermine and restrict human rights. So in a nutshell, I think that's why a human rights approach to CE is so important.
And that, so just to clarify, there's legal and illegal harms that happen in that hateful extremism bracket. There are things beyond illegality, things that don't meet the threshold.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a really interesting question because obviously one of the things that we're doing at the moment is a legal review into hateful extremism. I've appointed the former head of CT, Sir Mark Rowley, to lead on that review, because that's the thing that we want to understand is some of the behaviours that we consider to be legal, actually, should they be lawful? You know, and I think sort of kind of reviewing the laws around that and identifying if there are any gaps in the law is really critical. And I think that's long overdue. So I'm really proud that as a commission, that's something that we're doing on, and hopefully we'll be reporting on our findings in a couple of months' time.
That is a really interesting topic, because the idea that, you know, perhaps some things are beyond the bounds of acceptability is something that often we see the word extremism lobbed in, right? So J.K. Rowling, you know, very high profile example, people were calling her an extremist. People were suggesting the people that were abusing her were anti-free speech extremists. You know, people might call me an extremist for seeking regulation of the internet. You know, I think there should be certain regulations on around online harms. Is that extremism? Like, do we lose all meaning of the word? Are the societal boundaries kind of being blurred because extremism is just a word that now people use to describe behaviour they don't like or a view they don't like?
Yeah, I mean, well, I've also been called an extremist, and so, you know, it's one of those words that I think it's not so much about the word as it's more about the way we use that word and the fact that we're overusing it and in using it completely in all the wrong context. I mean, calling J.K. Rowling an extremist is just absurd. And I remember, I mean, it was this time last year actually with the whole Brexit debate, and I mean, it feels like millions of years ago now, but I mean, with the whole Brexit debate, and I vividly remember MPs calling each other extremists because they didn't like their view on Brexit. And again, it's just blatantly wrong, because how big is the gap between, on the one hand, we recognise that terrorists are extremists, but on the other hand, we're using that same word to call other MPs whose democratic views on Brexit we don't like as extremists. It's just, that's absurd and it's ridiculous. And so I think for us, and for me in particular, it's more about the meaning and the definition. And I think And you know, there are, and what's really struck me is that this issue isn't just confined to the word extremism. There are lots of passionate disagreements and debates about all types of words now and where the boundaries lie. So what is and what isn't considered to be racism that's the debate we're seeing fighting over Twitter all the time. What isn't free speech? What do we consider to be Islamophobic or not? What do we consider anti-Semitic or not? And those debates are raging all the time, every day. And I think, so extremism in that sense as a word isn't that kind of unique to itself. And I think the three things I think we need to kind of grapple with all of these words really is firstly making sure that we do have a definition and it's better clearly defined and that we understand what it means. Secondly, that we try and build consensus around it. I mean, you'll never get 100% consensus, but you can build a kind of a bigger consensus around what these words mean. And then thirdly, I think we have to be very clear in defining the boundaries. And I think that's critical, because knowing what is and what isn't extremism, what is and what isn't racism, that's something we as a society have to get better at doing, because the blurring of the boundaries, I think, is becomes deeply, deeply problematic, particularly if you're trying to counter extremism and those boundaries are becoming blurred.
I completely agree. I mean, we've seen obviously there's big debates over the definitions of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Anti-Semitism, I think there's general agreement. I think that I wouldn't want to speak for the Muslim community, but there seems to be broad agreement about the definition of Islamophobia. But obviously, there's still some way to go in that being fully defined. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It has to be appropriately defined now. We've seen, you know, for example, the campaign network around Tommy Robinson or Katie Hopkins, you know, adopting say free speech language, right? They're free speech kind of campaigners on BitChute, right? Which I see as this kind of, for people that don't know, it's like an evil YouTube. It's just hate-filled videos one after the other. They'll say that they're a free speech platform. They're guardians of free expression. Meanwhile, there are those that are kind of parading themselves as anti-racists, you know, but they're engaging in anti-Jewish abuse, anti-Muslim abuse. How much does that complicate? And you've already touched on this to an extent, but how much does that complicate things for you, right? If people come along and say, you know, on the one side I'm X, on the other side I'm this, do you then find it more difficult to class perhaps the individuals or groups as extremists when they turn around and say, actually, you've got this all wrong. We're free speech advocates. We're anti-racist. We cannot be extremists. How do you address that?
I mean, this is such a critical point you've raised, Danny, because, you know, my work is countering extremism. It's not about putting my hand and meddling with what's happening in the mainstream. But I also recognise that the debates that we're having in the mainstream are incredibly polarised on particularly things like free speech and anti-racism. We're not being clear on what those boundaries are, and they are becoming blurred. And one thing I have seen time and time again is how extremists are exploiting both the anti-racism agenda and the free speech cause, weaponising them to further their own extremist propaganda. So you're absolutely right about some of these online platforms, far-right extremists who are increasingly been using the argument of free speech to actually incite hate and violence and even terrorism in some cases under the guise of free speech. And it's completely ridiculous. And on the anti-racism side, I mean, I've seen, and I have to say, it's in particular with Islamists in this country, Islamist groups who have hijacked the anti-racism movement and cause, where they go around calling anybody who critiques Islamist ideology as being Islamophobes. I mean, I've lost count the number of times I have been labelled as an Islamophobe as a Muslim. I remember Cage, last year they did some sort of report where they labelled the entire commission as being driven by the Islamophobia agenda. And a lot of the people on the expert group, people like Lord Anderson, Nick Lowles of Hope Not Hate, and they kind of said that all of them were part of the Islamophobia agenda. I mean, even someone like Nick Lowles of Hope Not Hate was considered to be part of the Islamophobia industry. And again, what they were using was this argument of racism. And so I think that's really, really problematic. And I think what I would really, really like to see is free speech organisations and activists and anti-racist organisations and activists police those boundaries better and call it out, to recognise that, look, you know, if I'm running a free speech organisation, I'm seeing Tommy Robinson, these online platforms, weaponising free speech and using it and undermining it to promote hatred against minorities, that they are using free speech to attack our democratic values. They've got to call that out. It's not, I think there's an obligation on them to do that, because if they don't do it, everything else becomes murkier. So they have a really important role, I think. People who care about anti-racism, people who care about free speech, and both those issues are issues really close to my own heart, that we have to police those boundaries better, because otherwise the extremists are telling us what free speech looks like and what anti-racism looks like.
So that's a challenge to the Index on Censorship and the Free Speech Union and all of that, and I suppose to us to go out and say to people, you know, this isn't what anti-racism is. This isn't what free speech is.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's one we'll take on. We're happy to have the challenge. So the Antisemitism Policy Trust provides a secretariat to the APPG against anti-Semitism, and the principle the group has taken, this was John Mann's stance for many years, was the issues emanating from a particular party are the responsibility of the leadership of the group to take on within their own party, right? Anti-Semitism shouldn't become a party political matter. And there seems to be this kind of reticence in public life, perhaps, I'm probably generalizing a bit, but a nervousness about self-examination, right? About saying, you know, there's a problem here in our party or our institution or our organization. Is that an accurate assessment? And if so, like, how do we achieve a consistency in addressing extremism? You know, how can we get that personal responsibility? You were just, you know, talking about responsibility. How do we engender that in organizations, institutions, and individuals?
Yeah, again, you know, great question, Danny. I mean, you know, I have to say, I praise Lord Mann and even, you know, the work of the APPG and other MPs who are able to call out the hate and extremism, intolerance that they are seeing from within their own parties. And, you know, it's really interesting, because I think as human beings, it's really easy to point your finger and find the flaws in other people and go, oh, you know, you've done this, you've done that. You know, we see this on Twitter all the time and on social media platforms. It is much harder to sit down and examine yourself and the flaws that you have. And so I've seen this consistently, where whether it's political parties or religious organisations or certain, you know, activist organisations or NGOs, where if I go to them and say, look, there's a problem here, they'll say, well, why are you talking to us about this issue? Go and speak to, you know, what are you doing about them lot? So, you know, I've spoken to people on the right, for example, where I've said to them, okay, look, we've got a challenge of far right extremism. What can we do? And people from the political right have turned around to me and said, well, hang on a minute, shouldn't you be focusing on Islamist extremism? And then if I go to certain religious communities, they'll turn around and say to me, well, hang on, why are you coming to speak to us? Why don't you go to speak to that religious community? Or if I go and speak to left-wing activists, they'll say to me, hang on, you should be talking to us about the far right, not left-wing anti-Semitism, for example. And I think for me, if you come from a human rights background, I just find that totally problematic, because you absolutely need a consistent approach. You need to recognise that extremism exists across all different types of groups of people, because it's a human problem. And so we have to tackle all of them. But secondly, I think to be able to call out the extremism or the hate from within our own back garden, that requires leadership and something I don't see that often. And it requires bravery and it requires courage. And it means sometimes you will have people calling you all sorts of names. I've experienced that myself. You know, when I've spoken out against Islamist extremism, the abuse that I've experienced from other members of my own faith community, you know, has been horrific. But I fundamentally believe it's all very well calling out the hate in other communities, but it's got to start with what's happening in your own household. It's got to start what's happening with your own backyard. If you're not prepared to tackle it there, why should anybody listen to you if you're calling it out from another place? So I think it's really important that we tackle it everywhere. Wherever we see, we have to tackle it in all places and in all its shapes and forms.
We did have a question in, by the way, on the kind of the be it antipathy or criticism from some organisations, particularly Muslim organisations, about your kind of your role or your criticism. I mean, you kind of, were you surprised by that? Somebody's asking.
Absolutely not at all. I was fully expecting that response. You know, I mean, throughout my career, having countered extremism, particularly Islamist extremism, the kind of conspiracy theories, the disinformation that have been peddled about me over the years has been quite shocking. I mean, I've had to go to the police because of the threats and abuse that I've experienced from Islamists in this country, and unfortunately, that, you know, it's really shocking. And you know, I remember what was really striking was, I remember one particular politician, you know, a Muslim politician, went onto the mainstream media after my appointment and just came out with some of the actual Islamist conspiracy theories about me, saying, for example, that, oh, the book that I've co-authored, and she claimed that book had been written by the Home Office. And you kind of sitting there thinking, you're actually quoting an Islamist conspiracy theory about me. And so again, I just think, you know, I've lived disinformation. I mean, it's a really interesting topic, and conspiracy theories, because we talk about it all the time. And particularly with disinformation, we talk about it from the form of foreign states' intervention, Russia. But actually, I know from my own experience that people are living through disinformation about themselves every single day. And particularly, you know, politicians, I'm sure you experience this all the time. And, you know, so I think there's two things. I think there's a kind of a certain amount of disinformation about me, and conspiracy theories that have been written about me. But secondly, also, I just think there are people who quite simply do not like what I stand for. The fact that throughout my life, I have countered anti-Semitism, I have spoken out against homophobia, I have tackled anti-Ahmadiyya hatred, I have campaigned for gender equality, I have spoken out about Islamophobia and Islamist extremism. You don't gain a lot of friends often when you speak out about those things, but you do gain a lot of enemies. But you know what? That's something I've lived with for all my life. And if that means, if I have to fight for those values, and I experienced that abuse and I've suffered for it, so be it. That's something I'm prepared to do, because it's something I care far more about.
It's fair to say that some of the least popular people in Parliament, at least in my experience, are often some of the most outspoken, particularly on racism. And yeah, there's a lot to say about being unpopular with the wrong people.
I mean, it's sad to say it, but I feel like it's part of the job description, the level of hate and abuse. You know, it's really sad, but so I didn't expect, you know, I'm not surprised at all by that response to my appointment.
Yeah. Okay, well, moving on. To what extent, we know that anti-Semitism peaks around certain events. Certainly historically, that's the case. The Community Security Trust figures indicate that very clearly. To what extent, I mean, and you've touched on this, but say Brexit, right? There's a polarization that goes with that. To what extent does that feed extremism? And perhaps can we foresee any of that? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, I don't think events per se necessarily. I mean, it's hard because you've got to take it on a case by case situation. I mean, you know, every time there's been an Islamist terror attack in this country, we've seen a rise in hate crime against Muslims. So, you know, I think, you know, you've got to take it case by case. But I think, again, what I've tend to found is, you know, whether it's Brexit, whether it's COVID, whether it's, you know, been a whole host of other issues, it's not so much about the events as it is people actually exploiting those events. And so again, even if after an Islamist terror attack, what's the first thing you see? You see far-right extremists going on Twitter, blaming all Muslims. And so they're using that event to further generate hatred against other people. And again, you saw that with Brexit as well. How again far-right extremists were using it to actually whip up hatred. I mean, some of the level of violence, incitement of violence against other MPs, for example, was testament to that as well. So I think sometimes we've got to be careful about distinguishing between the events, but actually people are exploiting those events to drive extremism.
So there are questions coming in, which we will get to for those that have asked, but the nature of the threat since you took on the role, has it changed? You know, did you mentioned Islamists? Did it start with Islamists to move to the far right? Certainly, we've heard a lot about far right referrals through the Prevent system. Has it changed?
I mean, I think extremism as a whole has changed quite considerably. I'd say over the last 5-7 years or so. I think the modern day face of extremism has morphed quite a lot. I mean, you know, you're right in terms of Prevent referral figures, a third are for the far right, a third are for Islamists. But interestingly now you're seeing a third which is around mixed ideology or unstable ideologies. And particularly with online extremism, what we're seeing is how, you know, you're seeing individuals where it's not clear which ideology they're belonging from, and they're taking from all sorts of different ideologies. So I know of cases of people who were radicalized by far-right extremist videos, Islamist videos. They were taking it from wherever they could get it from and were just predisposed really motivated by violence. And so it's becoming a lot more difficult in terms of how these ideologies are mixing. But I think what's really challenging now is just the problem of online extremism. The scale of it that we're seeing is pretty frightening, and it has changed. It has changed, I think, the nature of extremism in our country and our ability to counter it. So, it has absolutely changed. I mean, in the last couple of months with the pandemic, I mean, we published a report in July this year showing how the pandemic itself has changed extremism in this country, how extremists have exploited it. And one of the concerns that we've got, and it was one of the things we wrote about in the report, was if you look at the long-term impacts of the pandemic, particularly from the lockdown, the socioeconomic impacts and the incredible worrying rates of unemployment that we're going to see in this country, I genuinely worry and fear of how extremists will exploit that, because there will be resentment, there will be anger, there will be people struggling, and often in those situations, people will be looking to scapegoat, to blame other people, often in this case it's minorities. And there will be extremists who will be on that step trying to exploit every second of what's coming our way. So we have to make sure we're well prepared for that, but have a counter-extremism policy that's flexible, that recognises the changing threat of this modern day face of extremism.
It's definitely, I mean, in respect of anti-Semitism, it's definitely fertile ground. We've seen the conspiracy theories, the CST that I mentioned ourselves wrote reports about this throughout the pandemic, Jews responsible for the pandemic, spreading the pandemic, all of that conspiracy narrative. So, that was spread online through be it Telegram or BitChute or some of the alternative media sites, Gab, 4chan, 8chan. There's this online harms bill that we're all waiting for from government. I mean, how can we tackle this online radicalization, recruitment, extremism? What do you think we need to do with the online harms bill to make it as effective as possible? How do we tackle this?
I mean, I think the issue of online extremism is just one of the biggest challenges of our time. And in my role, the stuff that I see, I just have to pinch myself, because I just kind of think, how on earth is this possible that we're seeing this type of material? Some of the examples that your work has highlighted, CST, in terms of the type of awful, violent, dangerous conspiracy theories, calling on people to deliberately infect Jews, to target synagogues. It's just shocking. Like, I find, and not only that, but the scale of it as well. Thousands of extremist videos being uploaded, being shared, if not hundreds of thousands. A lot of that material being viewed by millions of people. I mean, some of the David Icke conspiracy theories that were propagated during the pandemic, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, one video was viewed 5.9 million times. We're not talking small numbers here. So I think the aspiration set out by the government in the online harms bill is clearly something I welcome. But I suppose, I've got two main concerns. And I suppose the first is that extremism and online extremist content hasn't been defined in that white paper. And so there's little detail or clarity on what type of online extremist content material Ofcom, if it is Ofcom, will regulate, and how it will actually come to those assessments while also ensuring freedom of speech. Because, I can tell you this is a genuinely difficult and complex policy area, and you need expertise in this area. Now, Ofcom are clearly experts in broadcasting, but they are not experts in extremism, unlike the Commission, for example. I think, secondly, my concern is that we have to ask ourselves, if you look at what's being asked of Ofcom, if it's going to be the regulator, they are going to have to deal with CSE issues, terrorism content online, and even that's a hell of a lot of content we're talking about. And as I've talked about, the scale of online extremism is frankly eye-watering. So there's a question there of, well, do we genuinely think they're going to be able to deal with the issue of online extremism that the Commission is referring to? And what's happened over the last couple of months actually is a lot of stakeholders, and in particular a number of Jewish organisations, have been very clear to me that they think what's going to happen is that we are going to end up seeing a watered down bill. And that's the last thing any of us want to see. And that's surely, I don't want to see that at all. So I suppose in terms of solution, what I would like to see is the government recognising the role that the Commission could play here. We've started off with a definition of hateful extremism, but even I recognise and know that that's not enough. The next step that I would like to take forward is to develop a kind of innovative and transparent classification system of hateful extremist material and behaviour, which recognises that, look, all of this content isn't the same. Inciting violence, for example, is different to inciting hate, which is different to somebody making an ignorant racist comment. And there's a lot of degrees in between. So what I want to do is to devise a clear and open and transparent classification system, which, again, defines the boundaries of where these behaviours are, and to carry out those assessments and then pass that over to Ofcom, who then enforce it, because they are the enforcer and they make those enforcements with the social media companies. And I think that's really critical here. And so what I would like to see is the government putting the Commission on independent statutory basis on that kind of footing where we publish this kind of material. And so I think that's really critical. And we know the Online Harms Bill talks about a duty of care, but I think also what we need is a duty placed on social media companies to have due regard to the recommendations of the Commission about online extremism. Because I just worry that, for Ofcom, I think the issue of online extremism I think it'll be very tempting for them to put it into the too difficult box, which is what's happened with extremism over the years. None of us want to see that, and I think the Commission here can play a really powerful and important role.
Well, I'll happily publicly announce we'll support you in that.
Thank you.
I believe in joined up governance. I think that, we've got the BBFC that also has a regulatory role at the moment, as well as Ofcom. So we want to see them working together. It would make sense to me, at least, that having an expert organisation work with the regulator so that we can have coherence would be sensible. And critically, you're talking classification, we're really concerned about the legal but harmful material. So initially, when the government talked about addressing online harms, what they recognised, it wasn't just the criminal, the illegal material that needed to come down. There are harms that are caused. We've seen it in the US with Pizzagate. Somebody takes on a lot of material online, no history of any violence or extremism, goes to a pizza place with a knife and a gun to find out what's going on because they thought there was a paedophile ring. Finsbury Park Mosque, somebody watching YouTube videos over 3 weeks, was it? And all of a sudden, going and carrying out a terror attack. Do you have any other ideas about how we might address those kind of material? I mean, for me, I should say we want systems level ways of dealing with them, directing people away from the hate, having that code of practice. Is that something you agree with? Or is there more we can do? Anything else?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and again, this is where I think the kind of a classification system is really critical here. And also it's something where I think you'd have to include conspiracy theories in here, because again, we often treat conspiracy theories as some kind of harmless joke. Oh, it's all wacky. No one takes this stuff seriously. And, when we're talking about, I don't know, people believing whether, Dinah was killed by the establishment, for example, that's very different to someone saying the type of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that you and I see all the time in terms of targeting synagogues and so forth. So I think devising that classification system is absolutely critical. But again, this point about the law, what is actually considered to be legal? And again, this is where our work around the legal review is so critical, because I think we will end up changing the boundaries. If government adopts our proposals, we will end up changing the boundaries of what is legal and illegal around extremist content. And again, that we need to give that clarity to social media companies. I mean, because to be fair to them, my commission's had lots of meetings with them over the last 2.5 years. They've turned around and said to us, well, look, you've got to tell us, well, what do you mean by extremist content? What do you define as extremist content? Give us that clarity. And so, I recognise that, and they're asking the government to do that. So again, devising this kind of classification system and what the response should be, being very clear about the types of material we're talking about, defining the boundaries, that has got to be a fundamental part of the Online Harms Bill. If we really genuinely want to tackle this. And again, like I said earlier, it's got to be an expert body like the Commission, but I'm in complete agreement with you. I want to see a joined up response where, organisations like yourself, if you see that type of material, you feed into us, where we make that assessment, and we make quite a rapid assessment as well. It's got to be something that's quite quick. But again, this is quite a lot of what we're talking about. And it means that, it's asking the government, look, we've got to be part of the solution, where again, we want to help you make sure Britain is one of the most safest places to be online.
Well, we'll look forward to working with you on that. I've just on classification, actually, Dame Louise Ellman, who you will know, and who's joined us on a number of these, has asked whether sometimes the term anti-Semitism is not widely understood. Have you had that? Have you been talking about anti-Semitism with people and had kind of strange, puzzled faces looking back at you at all?
I mean, not particularly. I mean, I know it's a fascinating issue. I mean, I've met Jewish activists themselves who said that, you know, and very well known, I have to say, Jewish activists who do a lot of work countering and speaking out against the Holocaust and doing education around the Holocaust, and who've said to me, actually, look, we don't actually like the term anti-Semitism. We actually prefer anti-Jewish bigotry. So I know there's always going to be these types of debates, and, you know, it's similar to the kind of anti-Muslim hatred, Islamophobia debate as well. But I think it's not so much about the word, it's again where the boundaries are. And again, this is, I suppose, where the discussions and the debate within the left has been about what is anti-Semitism, what isn't anti-Semitism, at what point can you criticize Israel and what point can't you, and all the rest of it. So again, it's not so much about the word, but having in-depth discussions about what it means and giving practical examples. And I think those kind of things are really, really helpful. But I mean, you know, overall, I think the work of the IHRA definition, I think, has been pivotal because it has helped to provide a much more clearer definition of anti-Semitism in a way that nobody else. And I know it took years and years and it was a global endeavour, but it shows that blood, sweat and tears was really worth it. And I think over time that will become accepted and normalised, and, you know, school kids will be taught about it. But, you know, so that type of hard work is really, really important. It's a great start. But again, you know, definition work is only part of the challenge. The next step really then is to actively counter anti-Semitism, to teach young people about what it looks like and why it's wrong, to help them understand the experiences of victims, for example. And so all of that type of work is critical just as much as it is about the defining issue as well.
And you know, talking about how we address all this, you know, I've got family, you've got family. How best do we engage young people in combating extremism? Is it something we do at a young age that we just teach our kids? As you say, is it about democracy or is it something else? How's the most effective way for us ordinary people on the ground to tackle something so huge?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's such a concern for many parents. You know, the fear that, you know, we all know that our kids have all got smartphones. God, you know, what are they viewing online? It's as a parent, I'm constantly worrying all the time. And again, you know, this is why I really support the work of the government in terms of the online harms bill and looking at issues around that as well. So it's really critical. I mean, I think there's never one simple answer, is there? I mean, I think talking to your children, having these kind of challenging conversations with them, making sure they're not living in an echo chamber as well, where they're only being exposed to one idea. I think exposing them to the marketplace of ideas is really critical. But also, I think, you know, as parents, just trust our own judgment. You know, we know when our kids are not behaving in the way that they normally do. I mean, I think we can make the distinction between a moody teenager and, you know, when our kids are kind of going off the rails a little bit and what that they are maybe being preyed on. So I think being able to recognise those early signs of radicalisation is really critical as well. But, you know, at the same time, you know, I've spoken to thousands and thousands of young kids over the years. I've delivered loads of presentations to young people about extremism, from primary school age up to you know, university and college age. And I have to say that, you know, I actually believe that a lot of young people are the future. You know, they feel so passionate about this issue. And when I framed it in the context of human rights, again, they get it, they understand it. They do, when you frame it through the language of democratic values, they care and it becomes a cause to them. And I say to them, this is a cause and it's something you have to stand up to. So I think, you know, the future is also young people, that they are the ones that are our next generation of counter-extremists. And so working with them, empowering them and helping them to lead this work is again, it's something we all have to do, because us old fogies will want to retire at some point and we have to think about the next generation of people.
Quite right. I feel very old already.
So do I. This work makes you feel old as well, Danny, to be honest.
But I mean, it's an important point. You know, the online harms bill will have something on education. We haven't seen what it is yet, but there will be some kind of digital education strategy. So hopefully in that.
And you know what? We need a national curriculum now that is going to be able to deal with the challenges of the 21st century, and this is absolutely one of them. And so we've got to be able to help build resilience and equip kids to deal with this stuff, you know. So I think, but it can't be just like a side on the curriculum. It's got to be a part of the curriculum itself, I feel.
Oh, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we're running out of time. I've still got a few questions, so I'll try and get through them all.
Okay.
The Anne Frank Trust asked, you know, they run anti-prejudice education in schools across the country using the life and work of Anne Frank, both as a tragic example of what can happen when extremism goes unchecked, and as a role model of how a young person can assert their humanity by telling their story. What role do you see for personal histories and experiences in educating and standing up to extremism?
Oh, massive. I think it's critical. I mean, what you see extremists do all the time is share stories, and it's such a powerful way of recruiting people to their cause. And I think one of the most effective ways of countering extremism is through real life stories. And so getting people talking about their experiences of extremism. I mean, this is why the stories of Holocaust survivors are so powerful and moving. And when you see them going into schools and the impact it's had on children, it's just remarkable. And it's the same with survivors of the Bosnian genocide and Rwanda, and these kind of real life experiences are so critical because they are direct victims of extremism. And you're showing how again, it started from somewhere small. It was the seed, you know, sowing the seed of hate against other people, and what that can lead to. So I think those types of initiatives are absolutely critical. You know, you can't compare a real person who's experienced extremism, or even, you know, some of the former extremists who are doing great work going into schools. They're all going into schools and just sharing those experiences. I mean, I've seen, you know, young people's minds just transform in front of you because they're inspired by it. So yeah, I think that's a really critical and an important way of looking at this issue.
Brilliant. I've got a question come in about what is the best way as dealing with actors like Cage, right? So I don't know if they're not necessarily Cage itself, but let's say actors in that space. Right? Is there a particular way? And perhaps we can also, you know, I was going to ask you earlier and you touched on it, dealing with conspiracy theories. I suppose this is more a question about best practice. So how do we effectively address conspiracy theories? So are there things that you've picked up, and I'll broaden it, you can go from specific to general. Are there things that you've picked up in terms of effective ways of combating extremism or the path to extremism?
So I suppose I suppose that's kind of two questions. I suppose the first question is, I mean, one of the things that struck me is how, you know, again, and it's this point about consistency, that we don't give platforms or provide support to extremists. I mean, you know, I've met many organisations who would say, oh, I'd never give a platform to Tommy Robinson or to certain far-right extremist groups. But then I've seen them happily give a platform and support to Islamist organisations, you know, and sometimes often it's been organisations, anti-racist organisations and organisations on the left. And that, for me, is deeply concerning because, again, what are our values here? You know, if you've got organisations which have invited terrorists to speak at the convicted terrorist speakers to their events, or, you know, just awful, horrific things, it's just amazing that we don't apply that consistent approach. And I think the reality is, look, you know, extremism is always going to exist in our society. The question is that what we would like to see is how it's confined to the fringes of our society. We should all start worrying when it moves from the fringes into the mainstream. And when we start normalizing extremist organizations, we work with them, we fund them, we give them a platform. That's how it infiltrates into the mainstream. So we've got to be very careful of who we are supporting, who we are endorsing, who we are legitimizing. Now, that's not to say that we should not work with people who are vulnerable to extremist ideas, because fundamentally we want to change their views. And there's always that approach of where you're drawing the line between legitimization, but actually working towards people to make sure you are shifting them and moving them away from extremism. That's critical, because I think sometimes that gets lost. But I think the point about making sure we're not legitimizing these organizations, which I've seen many well-meaning, good, and even human rights organizations do, I think is a real stain, you know, on people who care about equality and human rights, and that has to stop, I feel. In terms of conspiracy theories, I mean, I actually think this is one of the biggest challenges of our time. You know, the jury's still out on what we know is to be effective in countering it. And you know, there's a lot of research that needs to be done on this. I mean, my view, having seen, you know, some of that research, is I don't think one intervention is necessarily going to work for everybody. I think you're going to see a whole range of different interventions which will have different positive impacts on different people. And so we've got to recognise that, because we're not, you know, we're dealing with a whole host of different people here, and there's a whole spectrum of people that we're dealing with. And so, you know, I've seen all sorts of different types of videos. I mean, I know CST have done some great online videos tackling widely held anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which I think were really, really great. I've seen another Jewish organisation which has used satire, for example, to debunk anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And so very, very different. But I can imagine there'll be some people who will resonate with the satire material, and other people will resonate with the type of material CST are putting out. And I think you have to have a whole range of them, because one approach is not going to work for everybody. But again, I think, like I said earlier, the jury's still out on what works, but it is absolutely one of the most, I think, one of the difficult challenges of our time when we're talking about extremism.
And I'll put in a plug for our video. On our site, we've got these videos, which are instructional videos on how to be an anti-Semite. As you say, these are kind of funny videos, but they have a serious, obviously, message. So that's antisemitism.org.uk. Moving to your kind of, we're going to finish in a second. I'll combine the question, the most challenging part of your work, and also whether you've seen a particularly innovative project or a surprising project or an exciting project. So your wider overview on those.
Yeah, so projects. I mean, I suppose for me, to be honest, actually, it's not so much for me about projects as it is about people. It's about people who do counter extremism work. I mean, I am just in awe of people who do this work, because, you know, and I've obviously met many of them. It's not a 9-to-5 job for them. If you're mad enough to do this work, it's because you genuinely care. And again, it's because it's a cause. And, you know, it was part of our report that we published in October last year, Challenging Hateful Extremism. We did a survey where we found 78% of people who do this work experience abuse, intimidation, harassment. Some of the stories I heard where people had to move homes. They lost family and friends. I mean, that is what the impact of people who do this work. I mean, all the journalists I've spoken to who've written about extremism, who've exposed it, who've done investigative pieces, the impact it's had on their lives, you know, again, just shocked at how extremists have targeted them because they do this work. And, you know, then we have to start thinking about what is the impact on a free press in this country. But people, you know, for me, I guess the inspiration I take is from people who do this work. And, you know, I remember Steve Bannon about 2 years ago, where he said something like, you know, Tommy Robinson is the backbone of Britain, is the backbone of our country. I just thought that's just absolutely crazy. I mean, in my view, the backbone of this country are people who do counter-extremism work, and organisations like yourself, Antisemitism Trust, Danny, and the work that you do, because it is difficult, it is challenging. You get a lot of abuse and threats, and, you know, people who are prepared to do that in the face of extremism, they are the backbone of our country. And I sometimes think society doesn't really understand or appreciate just how much sacrifice people have to make to do this work, the impact it has on your personal life, the impact it's had on my children's life, for example. And I think we need to do far more to support those who do their work, because they are absolutely vital in ensuring that we preserve our democracy. So again, I suppose that also answers one of the questions about the challenges. That level of abuse and intimidation is really difficult to deal with. And I suppose other challenges are things like misinformation that goes round about counter-extremism as well, online extremism, conspiracy theories. I mean, another, I suppose two other ones I suppose one thing that really irritates me is when politicians use the issue of counter-extremism as a political football. It's, you know, and I've seen that happen over the years. We've seen that with Prevent, and it's really, we don't want to be seeing that, because this is a serious issue. This is about the lives of people. This is about our society. And so really this issue is a cross-party political issue, and it doesn't matter which party you're from, we need to all come together to challenge this issue, because extremism threatens us all. And I suppose finally, just you know, I suppose me, I'm a long-standing activist. I like doing things, and I like things being done quickly. So when you're trying to change counter-extremism policy and you're working inside the government structure and Whitehall structure, often the wheels within Whitehall can turn rather frustratingly slow, which is personally for me a bit, you know, frustrating. But There's a whole range of different challenges. There's never one, but I suppose it's why it makes this work slightly more exciting as well.
Well, sorry, I mean, it's 4 o'clock. You've given us a lot of time. You talked about, individuals being the backbone of our society, those that are taking on extremism. Well, you're right in the middle of that. And I think we're safer, actually, and I think we're smarter because of the work that you're doing. And so thank you for that. Thank you for helping us as a society, as a Brit, just a regular civilian. I'm very grateful. We will continue to work with you and look forward to doing so. As you say, we've got many challenges, especially in the online realm. So thank you for giving us so much of your time today. Thank you for all you're doing. For those that are watching, we've got another Zoom with you in 2 weeks with John, soon to be Lord Woodcock, Special Envoy for Countering Violent Extremism. But Sara, we will be sharing this talk widely. You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Danny, and thanks for inviting me, for everyone to kind of listening in as well. So thanks very much for the great questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Sara. We'll say goodbye and look forward to seeing everyone soon. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.